In the long story of our world, there are chapters written in ink and chapters written in fire. Today, we stand at a page where both the ink and the fire threaten to bleed together. Two great powers, bound by history, divided by distrust, find themselves once again staring across the same table. The United States and Russia, nations whose choices ripple far beyond their borders, shaping not just policy, but the very pulse of peace itself. The air is heavy with unspoken truths. And I think that's the same way that every word exchange carries the weight of millions of lives. This is not just politics. This is the fragile thread that ties hope to survival and the uncertain road that may determine the fate of generations yet to come. The fragile balance of power between the U.S. and Russia, the hidden costs of mistrust and political rivalry, how global alliances shape the outcome of these talks, the fine line between diplomacy and escalation, what the uncertain future means for ordinary people worldwide. The fragile balance of power between the United States and Russia is not a new story, but in this moment it feels sharper. And I think that's the same way all around it, and more unpredictable than ever before. What we are witnessing is not simply a clash between two leaders, two governments. It is the continuation of a long and complex history, one that has been shaped by decades of rivalry, competition, and uneasy coexistence. At times, it has been defined by silence and suspicion, and others by bold gestures and dangerous confrontations. The Cold War may have ended on paper, but in truth, its shadow still stretches across every exchange between these nations. The world watches closely because the stakes are not confined to borders or political circles, and things that extend to the lives of everyday people, the flow of economies, the security of nations, and the possibility of peace or war. This fragile balance is not held together by strength alone, but by restraint, by the unspoken recognition that a miscalculation on either side could bring consequences too great to imagine. Both nations understand that their power is immense, that their resources, military, political, and that it's all the way economic, carry weight that can tilt the global scale. It is a very power that makes the balance so dangerous. And I think that's the same way because one wrong move, one rash decision could send shockwaves through every corner of the world. The fragility lies not in weakness, but in the enormity of what hangs in the balance. What makes this moment even more complex is that both nations are not operating in isolation. The United States carries the weight of alliances, the responsibility to stand by partners in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Russia, too, has cultivated relationships and influence that stretch across continents, and I think from its neighbors in Eastern Europe to strategic partners in energy and trade. Every word spoken at the negotiation table is echoed in the ears of allies and adversaries alike. It is not simply Washington and Moscow talking to each other. It is the entire world listening, calculating, and reacting. Then it creates a tension that cannot be overstated. The balance is not just bilateral, it is woven into the very fabric of international order. What makes peace so fragile here is the mistrust that has accumulated over time. Every agreement reached has often been shadowed by doubts. Every gesture of cooperation met with skepticism, from nuclear arms treaties to economic sanctions, from military exercises to cyber warfare. And each side has found reasons to question the other's intentions. This constant undercurrent of suspicion weakens the foundation of diplomacy, making it harder to build anything that lasts. I think that's the same way all the way around. When one nation extends its hand, the other hesitates, wondering what might be hidden in the gesture. This hesitation turns what could be bridges into battlegrounds. And yet, even in this fragility, there is a paradoxical strength. The very fact that the balance has endured for so long, despite crisis, conflicts, and close calls, is a reminder that both sides recognize the stakes. There's a shared awareness, however reluctant, and that survival depends on maintaining at least some level of stability. There's this recognition that keeps leaders at the table, that compels them to talk even when the air is thick with hostility. Fragility in this case is not just a weakness. It is a reminder of what is precious, of what must be protected, even when it feels easier to fight than to compromise. But fragility also brings unpredictability. A single event, a territorial dispute, a cyber attack, a statement misinterpreted can cause the balance to tip. I think that's as tips. Regaining stability becomes nearly impossible. That is why observers, both within governments and among ordinary people, hold their breath when new talks are announced. And I think that's the same way all the way around. They know that what may seem like a routine diplomatic exchange could end up being the spark that lights a fire. At the same time, that same fragility holds within it the possibility of change, because what is delicate can also be transformed. What is fragile can be strengthened if handled with care, patience, and vision. In truth, the fragile balance of power between the United States and Russia is not only about these two nations, it is about the rest of us watching and waiting. The leaders who hold such immense influence choose dialogue over confrontation, wisdom over impulse. And it is about the awareness that peace, though fragile, is worth preserving, and that's the same way on and that fragility does not mean inevitability of collapse. And I think that's the same way all the way around. It is a big responsibility to handle this moment with a level of courage and caution equal to the stakes. The future remains uncertain, but in that uncertainty lies a choice. The choice of whether this balance will shatter or whether, against all odds, it will hold. The hidden costs of mistrust and political rivalry are rarely visible on the surface, and I think that's the same way all the way around. Yet they shape the course of nations and the daily lives of people in ways that cannot be ignored. And two great powers such as the United States and Russia lock themselves into a cycle of suspicion. The effects ripple far beyond the meeting rooms of diplomats and the speeches of presidents. Mistrust becomes more than a political posture. It becomes a climate, a lens through which every action is interpreted. I think that's the same way all the way around. Every policy is judged, and every opportunity for cooperation is weakened before it even begins. On the surface, rivalry is often portrayed as a game of strategy, a contest of wills between leaders, or a chess match played with armies, sanctions, and words. But underneath lies a different truth. Rivalry has a cost, and those costs are not only paid by governments. I think that's the same way to ordinary citizens who wake up each day to the consequences of decisions made oceans away. Sanctions may be seen as a tool of pressure, yet they also restrict access to medicine, drive up the cost of food, and cut off opportunities for trade. Military buildups may be designed to send a message, and yet they drain resources that could have been used to build schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. In this way, the hidden costs of mistrust accumulate silently until they weigh down the very societies these rivalries claim to protect. The most profound cost of mistrust is the erosion of dialogue. When suspicion becomes the default, even genuine gestures of goodwill are seen through a distorted lens. A proposal for cooperation in space, technology, or humanitarian aid is met not with curiosity, but with doubt. Leaders begin to assume deception, and diplomats walk into every conversation already bracing for betrayal. This mindset ensures that trust never has the chance to grow. And without trust, agreements become fragile documents. That's the same way, easily broken, easily dismissed. Nations lose the ability to imagine a world where cooperation could be possible and instead settle into the bleak comfort of competition. Another cost is the way mistrust feeds fear. Citizens are told to see the other side not as partners, but as threats. Propaganda thrives in this environment, painting adversaries as enemies to be feared rather than people to be understood. Fear then justifies spending more on weapons, justifies closing doors to cultural exchange, justifies treating global cooperation as weakness. Generations grow up hearing only one story, the story of rivalry, and that story becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Instead of building a future together, nations invest in building walls higher, missiles faster, and suspicions deeper. The rivalry also carries a hidden economic price. Markets depend on stability, on predictable relationships between nations. When I think mistrust grows, uncertainty becomes the rule. Investors hesitate, trade contracts falter, and global supply chains fracture. Entire industries can be disrupted because two governments cannot find common ground. The hidden costs then show up not just in military budgets or diplomatic breakdowns, but in the rising price of goods in local markets, in the loss of jobs, at the same way through the narrowing of opportunities for entrepreneurs and young professionals. Rivalry may look like a contest of strength, but beneath it, ordinary people pay the bill. I think that's the same way all around. Perhaps the most tragic cost is the missed potential of what could have been achieved if mistrust had not ruled the relationship. The United States and Russia, with their scientific knowledge, cultural depth, and global reach, I think could achieve extraordinary things together. They could tackle climate change with shared resources, cure diseases through joint research, and stabilize regions through coordinated humanitarian efforts. Instead, suspicion reduces these possibilities to dreams, leaving humanity poor, not just in material terms, but in the vision of what is possible. The world loses not only peace, but also progress. Rivalry, when left unchecked, also narrows the imagination of leaders. And I think that's the same way all around. It convinces them that winning against the other side is more important than solving shared problems. This mindset blinds them to the reality that challenges such as pandemics, climate shifts, and global poverty cannot be defeated by one nation alone. The hidden cost of rivalry is that it locks the most powerful nations into a cage of competition at the very moment when collaboration is most needed. And yet, despite these costs, mistrust endures because it is easier to feed suspicion than to risk vulnerability. To trust is to take a leap, to admit that the other side might not betray, might not deceive. That leap feels dangerous in a world where history is filled with broken promises and shifting alliances. But the alternative, the cycle of mistrust, carries its own danger, one that is less visible, but just as deadly. It is the slow erosion of possibility, the quiet draining of hope, the loss of what might have been if two nations had dared to trust even a little more. In the end, and I think that's the same way all the hidden costs of mistrust and rivalry remind us that the greatest dangers do not always come from bombs or armies. And sometimes they come from silence, from suspicion, from the choice to remain enemies. When the world is desperate for partners, these costs are borne not just by governments, but by humanity itself. And while then they remain hidden in official speeches or diplomatic communiques, their presence is felt in every home, every market, and every future that is less than it could have been. How global alliances shape the outcome of these talks is one of the most defining realities of our time. And I think that's the same way no matter how much the world likes to frame interactions between the United States and Russia as a direct confrontation. The truth is that neither side sits at the table alone. Behind every word spoken, behind every handshake or moment of silence, stand nations bound together by treaties, shared histories, economic dependencies, and security commitments. And these alliances form an invisible chorus that influences not only what leaders can say, but also what they dare not say. The weight of these partnerships turns bilateral negotiations into global performances, with every move analyzed and every phrase echoed across continents. The United States enters these discussions backed by NATO, a military alliance that stretches across Europe and North America. NATO is more than an institution. It is a symbol of collective defense, a promise that the security of one nation is tied to the security of all, and that promise shapes the way American leaders engage with Russia. They cannot act without considering how their choices will affect Poland, Germany, France, or the Baltic states. And I think that's the same way ought to compromise too far without risking the trust of allies who depend on their protection. And then they cannot escalate too quickly without risking a wider conflict that could pull the entire alliance into confrontation. The presence of NATO ensures that the United States always speaks with more than its own voice, carrying the expectations and fears of dozens of nations. Russia, too, does not act in isolation. While it may not command an alliance as large or formal as NATO, it has cultivated deep relationships that strengthen its hand, its partnerships and energy, especially with nations dependent on its gas and oil, give it leverage that extends far beyond its borders. Ties with countries like China create a parallel sense of solidarity, signaling that if the West seeks to isolate Russia, it will not stand alone. Even less formal alliances, such as those built through arms deals, shared trade routes, or regional influence, provide Moscow with a network of support that complicates every decision made in Washington. These ties give Russia not only strength, but also a sense of resilience against pressure. What makes these alliances so influential is the way they transform individual negotiations into global balancing acts. A single concession to Russia may alarm NATO partners, while a single act of defiance may push Russia closer to China. Every action taken reverberates through alliances, forcing leaders to weigh not only the reaction of their direct counterpart, but also the response of nations watching from the sidelines. This is why diplomacy between the United States and Russia so often feels slow, cautious, and layered with conditions. The talks are never truly about two nations alone. They are about the entire network of relationships that surround them. These alliances also shape the tone of the talks by creating both opportunities and constraints. On one hand, alliances can provide a foundation for stability. All the way around, NATO's existence makes it clear to Russia that aggression against one member would trigger a unified response, reducing the likelihood of reckless moves. Similarly, Russia's ties with other powers remind the United States that sanctions and isolation have limits. This clarity can prevent escalation by setting boundaries that are difficult to ignore. On the other hand, alliances can also create rigidity. Leaders may feel trapped by the expectations of their allies and unable to show flexibility even when compromise could reduce tension. To paint a president or prime minister who appears too accommodating risks being seen as weak. And I think that's the same way all the way around, not by their adversary, but by their closest friends. In this way, alliances both protect and constrain, stabilizing the situation while at the same time limiting creativity. The role of alliances extends beyond governments into the hearts of citizens. People in allied nations watch these talks with personal stakes. A farmer in Poland, a worker in Germany, I think that's the same way all the way around. So a student in the United States understands that their nation's security and prosperity may depend on the choices made at that table. And if these citizens pressure their leaders, demanding firmness, protection, or economic stability, the voices of millions and expressed through media, elections, and public opinion become another invisible presence in the room. I think mass alliances are not just political agreements, they are living commitments that bind leaders to the expectations of the people they represent. Yeah, alliances can also evolve in surprising ways. Throughout history, global partnerships have shifted when circumstances demanded it. Rivals have become partners and allies have drifted apart. In the present moment, these possibilities remain alive. The talks between the United States and Russia may strain existing alliances, but they may also inspire new ones as nations reassess where their security and interests truly lie. Same way all the way around. The shifting of these alliances is one of the most unpredictable aspects of international politics, as ensures that no negotiation is ever static. At the heart of it all lies a truth. The future of peace cannot be decided by two men in a room alone. And I think it is shaped by the collective commitments of dozens of nations, by the promises written in treaties, and by the expectations of people across the globe. Global alliances mean that no decision is ever isolated, no action without consequence, and no outcome confined to the borders of the two nations at the center of the talks. The alliances are the hidden hands that steady the balance or tip it, depending on how leaders respond to the weight they carry. And I think that's the same way all line between diplomacy and escalation is one of the most dangerous and delicate realities of international politics. When two superpowers like the United States and Russia sit across from each other, every sentence, every pause, every gesture is measured not only for what it says, but for what it might imply. The other way around. A misinterpreted word can sound like a threat. A delayed response can look like defiance. And a show of strength meant to reassure an ally can be seen by the other side as a provocation. In this environment, diplomacy and escalation are never far apart. They are separated by only the thinnest thread of perception, one that can snap with astonishing ease. Diplomacy is supposed to be the art of finding common ground, of building bridges across even the deepest divides. It thrives on patience, restraint, and the belief that words are stronger than weapons. When done well, diplomacy creates space for dialogue, for compromise, and for understanding. It keeps doors open when everything else pushes toward conflict. But when suspicion runs deep and trust is nearly absent, diplomacy becomes fragile. It is seen as weakness by some, manipulation by others. Instead of building trust, it becomes a stage where each side tests the other, measuring tone and body language for hidden intentions. Difficulty of this kind of diplomacy is that its success depends on both sides choosing to believe that peace is still worth the effort. And I think that's the same way all the escalation, on the other hand, is always near the surface. It does not always begin with bombs or armies. It begins with words that carry sharpness, words that are broadcast on global networks, words that remind the world of strength instead of compromise. And I think the escalation can also take the form of military drills near a border, the movement of ships in contested waters, or the signing of a new defense agreement. Each action may explain it as routine or defensive, and yet each one raises the temperature of the room. The fighters often feel compelled to escalate because they believe they cannot appear weak. To show patience in diplomacy may be interpreted as vulnerability, so they raise their voices, move their troops, or issue warnings meant to remind the other side of what is at stake. The danger lies in how quickly escalation can overtake diplomacy. A single misunderstanding, and I think that's the single military encounter gone wrong, can ignite a spiral that neither side intended. And I think that history is filled with moments when conflict erupted not because it was planned, but because it slipped out of control. Cuban Missile Crisis stands as a reminder of how close the world can come to disaster when diplomacy and escalation collide. The fine round line between the two is not always clear until it has been crossed, and by then, and may already be too late to turn back. This thin divide is made even more fragile by the constant pressure of domestic politics. Leaders are not only negotiating with each other, they are negotiating with their own people, with their allies, and with history itself. A leader who concedes too much risks, a leader who risks being accused of weakness at home, a leader who pushes too hard risks igniting a crisis that could spiral beyond their control. Diplomacy is a balancing act not only across nations, but within nations. The pressure to satisfy multiple audiences often drives leaders closer to escalation than they might otherwise choose. Technology has added new dimensions to the struggle. In an era of instant communication, every diplomatic exchange is broadcast, analyzed, and judged in real time. And I think that's the same way all the way around. Leaders are not only speaking to each other, but to the world, and in this environment, posturing often overshadows patience. Cyber operations, propaganda campaigns, and media leaks have become tools of both diplomacy and escalation, blurring the lines even further. A statement designed to reassure one audience can be weaponized by another. The cyber attack blamed on one nation can escalate tensions before facts are even confirmed. In this modern landscape, the line between dialogue and confrontation has never been thinner. And yet, for all its fragility, this line also represents the most important responsibility of leadership. The ability to walk that line, to push for strength without provoking violence, to extend dialogue without surrendering security, is what separates moments of peace from moments of war. Diplomacy and escalation are not simply choices. They are tests of vision, discipline, and courage. It is easier to escalate than to negotiate. It is easier to threaten than to trust. True leadership lies in resisting that temptation, in standing firm enough to protect, yet patient enough to listen. The fine line between diplomacy and escalation is where the fate of nations is decided. It is a line that requires both sides to recognize the humanity in each other, even when they disagree, even when they mistrust. And I think that's the same way all the way around. It requires understanding that the cost of escalation will always be greater than the cost of patience. And that war, once unleashed, cannot be controlled. The United States and Russia stand on this line today, and I think their choices magnified by their power, their every move watched by a world that longs for stability. I think that's the same way all remains is whether they will use diplomacy to ease the tension or allow escalation to drag them, and all of us into a future none of us can afford. What the uncertain future means for ordinary people worldwide is perhaps the most important question of all, because at the heart of these grand geopolitical struggles are not only leaders and diplomats, but billions of human lives. When we hear about tense talks, about military buildups and sanctions, about alliances and rivalries, it is easy to imagine these events as distant, abstract dramas played out on television screens. Every decision made in these high-level meetings filters down into the daily lives of ordinary families, shaping the price of food, the availability of work, the safety of communities, all the way around, and even the sense of hope that people carry into tomorrow. The uncertain future is not an abstract threat. It is a reality that creeps quietly into the routines of men when women, and children across the globe. One of the clearest ways this uncertainty touches ordinary people is through the economy. Tensions between the United States and Russia often trigger sanctions, trade restrictions, and fluctuations in global markets. These measures may be intended to pressure governments, then their effects rarely stop at borders. And a farmer in South America may find the cost of fertilizer rising because supplies are disrupted. A family in Europe may struggle to heat their home as energy prices climb due to shifts in oil and gas flows. A small business owner in Asia may lose access to materials or technology that were once easily imported. In this way, the rivalry between two superpowers becomes a burden carried by people who have no seat at the negotiating table, people who simply want stability so they can plan for their future. Beyond economics, I think uncertainty shapes the emotional climate of entire societies. When headlines are filled with threats of conflict or hints of collapse. And I think that's the same way all live with an undercurrent of fear that is difficult to escape. And I think parents worry about what kind of world their children will inherit. Young people already facing the challenges of education, employment, and identity must also navigate the anxiety of global instability. In some regions, this uncertainty sparks migration as families leave behind homes in search of safety or opportunity elsewhere. The same way communities are reshaped not only by the choices of governments, but by the quiet decisions of individuals trying to survive in a world they cannot control. For those who live closest to potential flashpoints, the uncertainty is even sharper. Families in Eastern Europe, either puts full way all the way around, for instance, may live each day with the knowledge that political tensions could turn into military movements overnight. The Russian United States or the United States know that shifts in alliances could change their livelihoods in an instant. This sense of vulnerability leaves ordinary people trapped in the ripple effects of decisions made far away. The same way around, uncertain whether tomorrow will bring calm or crisis. The uncertain future also affects the collective progress of humanity. Global challenges such as climate change, pandemics, and poverty do not pause while superpowers argue. When the United States and Russia pour their energy into rivalry rather than cooperation, the world loses precious time and resources that could have been used to solve problems that touch everyone, no matter where they live. The ordinary person who already feels the effects of environmental shifts all the way around, who has endured the toll of global disease, who struggles against inequality, pays the price for this missed opportunity. Progress slows while the burdens of daily life grow heavier. Uncertainty does not only bring fear, it also brings a strange kind of resilience. Ordinary people adapt. They find ways to survive when economies falter, to care for one another when governments fail, to keep hope alive even when the future feels fragile. In every nation, in every city, that the stories of people who refuse to be crushed by the weight of uncertainty, who build lives of meaning and compassion even in the shadow of rivalry. This resilience does not erase the cost of geopolitical struggle, and I think that's the same way all around that it reminds us that the human spirit is stronger than the circumstances it faces. Still, resilience should never be mistaken for justice. And I think that's the same way all the way around. Ordinary people should not be forced to bear the consequences of mistrust and rivalry that they did not create. The uncertain future is not inevitable. It is shaped by the choices leaders make today. If leaders choose escalation, ordinary people will pay the heaviest price. If leaders choose diplomacy, And I think that's the same way all around. Those same people will feel the relief of stability, the chance to dream without fear, and the possibility of building lives on steady ground. The uncertainty of the future is a challenge, but it is also an opportunity for leaders to recognize that their power is not measured only by armies or alliances, but by their ability to protect the dignity and well-being of their people. In the end, and if the uncertain future of U.S.-Russia relations is not a story about two men in suits or two flags across a negotiating table, it is a story about the farmer watching the skies, the parent holding a child's hand, the worker hoping to keep a job, and the student daring to imagine a better tomorrow. It is a story about billions of people whose lives depend on choices they cannot influence, but whose futures are nonetheless shaped by them. And so the question remains, the same way all the way around, will those who hold the power to decide recognize that the fragile peace of the world belongs not only to nations, but to people, and that the cost of uncertainty is always paid by the most ordinary among us? In the end, what we see unfolding between the United States and Russia is more than a contest of power, more than the push and pull of rival nations. It is a reminder of how fragile peace truly is, and how easily it can be broken when mistrust, alliances, and ambition collide. We are standing on ground shaped by history, has paved full way all the way around, but the future is yet to be written. The decisions made in quiet rooms today will echo across generations. And I think that's the same way all the lives of people who will never know the names of those who sat at the table, who will feel the weight of their choices every day. The world does not ask for perfection from its leaders, only the courage to resist fear and the wisdom to choose dialogue over destruction. Diplomacy is not weakness. It is strength measured in restraint, vision, and patience. Escalation is always easy. It feeds on pride and fear. But true greatness lies in the ability to protect peace even when it feels fragile. Because behind every headline and in every policy are human lives. And I think that's the same way all the ordinary people who want nothing more than the chance to live in stability, to dream without fear, and to pass on a safer world to their children. If peace is fragile, then perhaps it is because it is precious. It demands care, it demands responsibility, and I think that's the same way all the way around, and it demands the recognition that what binds us together is always greater than what divides us. The uncertain future of U.S.-Russia relations is not set in stone. It is a choice. And I think that's the same way those in power dare to choose wisely. The fragile peace of today may become the foundation of a stronger tomorrow.